August 1944. Northern France. The night is heavy with fog. A thick silver curtain draped across shattered roads and burned-out villages. The distant rumble of engines echoes through the darkness. Not tanks, not artillery, but hundreds of trucks moving in perfect rhythm. Their headlights are blacked out, their engines muffled with canvas. To German scouts hiding along the tree line, it seems impossible. Columns of American vehicles appear on roads the Luftwaffe had just bombed. Then they vanish into the mist, only to reappear 50 miles away by dawn, fully loaded, unstoppable, and silent. They carry no insignia, no lights, no radio chatter. Only speed, only precision. Local civilians whisper of phantom convoys, American trucks that move through night and mud without pause, feeding the advancing armies like ghosts. German officers call them Die Geisterkolonne, the ghost column. But this wasn't a myth or illusion. It was one of the greatest logistical operations in military history, a supply system so vast, so relentless, that it crushed the German front without a single tank shot. This is the story of the U.S. Army's Ghost Convoy. By late August 1944, the Allies had broken free from the beaches of Normandy. What began on June 6th, D-Day, had erupted into a massive, unrelenting advance across France. American, British, and Canadian forces were now pushing eastward faster than even their generals anticipated. The German lines were crumbling, their defenses unraveling after the collapse of the Falaise Pocket, but victory was threatened by an invisible enemy. Sans distance. The front lines were moving hundreds of miles from the Normandy, beaches where supplies were still being unloaded. Every bullet, every gallon of fuel, every ration of food had to cross a landscape shattered by war. Bridges destroyed, railways in ruins, and roads clogged with refugees and retreating enemy forces. General Dwight D. Eisenhower faced an impossible equation. His armies were winning too fast. The faster they advanced, the hungrier their engines became. Tanks ran dry, trucks idled for fuel that never came, and divisions stalled in the fields of France, not because of enemy fire, but because of empty tanks. By mid-August, the Allied command calculated that the advancing armies needed over 700,000 gallons of fuel per day just to keep moving. Ammunition stocks were running dangerously low. Railway reconstruction lagged behind. The vast logistical machine that sustained the invasion was stretched to its breaking point. Out of this crisis emerged an idea so audacious it seemed impossible: to create a continuous highway of supply that would operate day and night, connecting the Normandy depots directly to the front, a lifeline of motion, a river of trucks. The plan was drawn up in haste by the U.S. Army Transportation Corps and Quartermaster units under the direction of Brigadier General Ewart G. Plank and Major General John C. H. Lee of the Communications Zone, COMZ. The concept was simple in words, but monumental in execution. Dedicate a single, guarded route for two-way traffic. One road east for loaded trucks, another road west for the empties. Returning, this road would run nearly 700 kilometers from the beaches of Normandy to the fast-moving spearheads of General Patton's Third Army and General Hodges's First Army. Along this route, thousands of trucks, mainly the rugged GMC CCKW, 1 to 2 ton deuce and a half, would run in endless rotation. The convoys would not stop. They would not rest. Every 25 miles, refueling and maintenance stations would operate around the clock. The project was codenamed the Red Ball Express. The name came from U.S. railroad slang. A red ball run meant a high priority, non-stop shipment. On August 25, 1944, as Paris celebrated liberation, the first convoys rolled out. Within days, the operation grew into a roaring artery of steel and gasoline. The Germans, confused by how rapidly the Americans maintained momentum, began intercepting radio chatter describing trucks moving faster than rail could ever allow. Luftwaffe reconnaissance failed to track them. Their movements were too unpredictable, their routes too well concealed under camouflage nets and forest roads. To German intelligence, it made no sense. Fuel depots were bombed, rail bridges destroyed. Yet Patton's tanks still surged forward. Somewhere, they concluded, the Americans had built a hidden network. To frontline soldiers, it became something of a legend. The Geister convoy, the ghost convoy. But to the men behind the wheel, it was sweat, mud, exhaustion, and danger. Not myth, but method. And it was only the beginning. For the men of the Red Ball Express, the war was fought not with rifles or bombs, but with engines, tires, and grit. They weren't celebrated in newspapers, and few knew their names. Yet their mission was no less dangerous than that of the infantry they supplied. A single delay, a single missed convoy, could mean a division stranded without food, shells, or fuel. Nearly 75% of Red Ball Express drivers were African-American soldiers, serving in segregated units under white officers. Most had been trained as laborers or mechanics, never expecting to find themselves at the spearhead of the Allied advance. But when the logistical crisis hit, they were suddenly placed behind the wheels of thousands of trucks and told to drive non-stop into the unknown. Every mile was a test of endurance. The roads were choked with wreckage. Villages burned to ash. Bridges collapsed. Convoys often ran for 16 to 20 hours straight, their drivers running on coffee, cigarettes, and determination. Many had no maps, only hand-painted arrows nailed to trees, glowing faintly in the dim light of blackout lamps. The trucks themselves were mechanical beasts, roaring, vibrating, constantly threatening to overheat or break an axle. Soldiers named them like comrades. Big Bertha, Iron Lady, Sweet Lorraine. In pouring rain or under strafing fire, they coaxed them forward, one grinding gear at a time. To stay awake, drivers sang, shouted, or kept the cab windows open to let in the cold air. In some units, one man drove while the other slept sitting upright beside him, rotating every few hours. A few slipped into ditches from sheer exhaustion and never woke again. The enemy was always watching. Luftwaffe fighters hunted the convoys by day, forcing many to move primarily at night. Columns drove in total darkness. No headlights, no brake lights, just the faint red glow of the truck ahead. A moment's distraction could send a vehicle into a ravine or into another truck's rear axle. But there was pride in the hardship. For many black soldiers, the Red Ball Express was their first chance to prove themselves in the face of discrimination. Though barred from combat units, their role became vital to victory. They formed tight brotherhoods of trust. Mechanics, loaders, and drivers who could fix an engine with a wrench and a prayer, and who knew that no one else would get the job done if they failed. One driver later recalled, "We weren't fighting Germans. We were fighting distance, weather, and time." Their bravery didn't come with fanfare. There were no medals for endurance, no parades for the men who hauled gasoline under fire. But their contribution became undeniable. Patton himself later said that his army's advance would have ground to a halt without the Red Ball Express. Every truckload that reached the front meant another day the Allies could keep pressing east. Every mile conquered by wheels was a blow against Hitler's crumbling empire. And somewhere in the fog of northern France, their enemy was watching and growing confused. From the German perspective, what was happening behind the Allied front defied all known logic. Every map, every supply estimate, every aerial reconnaissance photo said the same thing. The Americans should have been running dry. By all military calculations, Patton's Third Army should have stalled weeks earlier. The rail lines from Normandy were still wrecked, depots destroyed, bridges unpassable. Yet somehow, the enemy's tanks kept advancing, fueled and fed at an impossible rate. To the German High Command, it was a riddle that intelligence couldn't solve. Divisions reported encountering fresh American units where no supply lines could exist. Abandoned airfields were suddenly filled with functioning trucks and refueled aircraft. Even reconnaissance units returning from behind Allied lines described unending columns of vehicles that appeared and disappeared through forested roads. Luftwaffe pilots attempted to track them from the air. But by the time daylight patrols reached the reported coordinates, the convoys were gone, vanished beneath camouflage nets, hidden under tree canopies, or already 50 miles east. When the weather turned foggy, they seemed to move like ghosts across the French countryside. Captured German soldiers began spreading rumors that the Americans had built secret underground highways, that supply trains were disguised as civilian traffic, or that parachute drops were being made by night in hidden clearings. Some believed the U.S. had developed a new form of mobile pipeline, a mechanical snake that slithered across the countryside. In truth, the explanation was far simpler and far more terrifying to German strategists. It wasn't technology, it was logistics. Every roadblock they destroyed was rebuilt within hours. Every bridge bombed was replaced overnight by U.S. Army engineers. Every captured map became obsolete within a day because the Americans were literally redrawing the battlefield, turning rural lanes and farm tracks into one of the most efficient military road networks ever built. By September, the Red Ball Express was moving 90% of all supplies for the U.S. 1st and 3rd Armies. Over 23,000 tons of ammunition, fuel, and rations were delivered every 24 hours. German field commanders who once believed they were fighting a mobile enemy now realized they were fighting an industrial one. A nation whose strength lay not only in its tanks or planes, but in its ability to move mountains of material faster than any army in history. Colonel Siegfried Westphal, Chief of Staff under Field Marshal Rommel, later admitted that the speed of the American advance was something no one in the Wehrmacht had imagined possible. The Allies, he said, had found a way to turn movement itself into a weapon. And so the myth grew. To the German soldier on the ground, the endless stream of trucks, unseen but ever present, became a symbol of inevitability, a whisper that the Americans would never stop coming. They called it der Geister Convoy, the ghost convoy. What the Germans couldn't understand was that every ghost they feared was a real man, exhausted, hungry, covered in dust and oil, gripping a steering wheel and refusing to stop. The myth, born of confusion and fear, would soon meet reality on the battlefield when the full power of this logistical miracle converged with one man's hunger for speed. General George S. Patton. By late August 1944, General George S. Patton was a man possessed by momentum. His Third Army had broken through the German lines in Normandy and was now racing across France with a ferocity unseen since the Blitzkrieg of 1940. Only, this time, it was the Americans who were moving faster than maps could record. But for all Patton's brilliance, his tanks were starving. Every armored division burned nearly 400,000 gallons of fuel per day, and traditional supply lines could not keep up. Eisenhower's headquarters warned that the Third Army would soon have to halt. To Patton, that word, halt, was unthinkable. His solution was simple and ruthless. Keep the Red Ball moving. The Red Ball Express became the artery of Patton's campaign. From Normandy's dusty beaches to the hedgerows of northern France, convoys rolled non-stop, day and night, carrying gasoline in 5-gallon jerry cans, ammunition in wooden crates, and food packed tight in steel drums. Convoy commanders planned routes like combat operations. The trucks formed in groups of 20 to 30, each led by a jeep and followed by maintenance and recovery vehicles. Every 10 miles, military police guided traffic with flashlights and whistles, keeping the line moving even through bombed-out villages. As the columns roared east, they became the visible pulse of the American advance. Drivers could see Patton's tanks ahead of them on the horizon, Sherman after Sherman rolling into battle, fed by the endless stream of supplies from behind. On September 1st, Patton's spearheads reached the Meuse River, hundreds of miles from Normandy. The German army was retreating in disarray, unable to form a stable front. But the closer Patton got to the German border, the worse his fuel crisis became. The Red Ball Express was carrying the entire Third Army on its back, and it was groaning under the weight. At one point, Patton ordered his staff to siphon fuel directly from supply convoys still en route to the front, a desperate move that risked collapsing the entire logistical rhythm. His commanders protested, but Patton's reply was ice cold. "My men can eat their belts, but my tanks have got to move." And they did. Despite fatigue, breakdowns, and German air raids, the convoys kept coming. In one 24-hour period, more than 132,000 gallons of fuel were delivered to Patton's armored columns. Entire truck companies bypassed rest stops, driving through the night with blackout lights and no radio communication. German observers, watching from the Ardennes hills, could only guess how the Americans managed it. Reconnaissance aircraft reported constant vehicular motion from dawn to dusk, as if the entire landscape itself were moving east. On the ground, American drivers began calling their endless route the Ghost Road. It wound through forests, fields, and bombed villages, a living supply chain that never stopped breathing. Each sunrise brought the same sound: engines growling, gears grinding, men shouting over roaring motors, another convoy pushing forward. They were no longer just truck drivers. They were the bloodstream of an advancing army. And soon, their relentless movement would bring Patton's forces to the very edge of Germany itself, setting the stage for the moment when the Ghost Convoy would finally reveal its true power. By the first week of September 1944, the Red Ball Express was operating at its peak. Nearly 6,000 trucks thundered along the route every day, carrying over 12,500 tons of supplies to the front. The convoys stretched for miles, an unbroken river of khaki and steel surging eastward through France. The Allied push had now reached the borders of Belgium and Luxembourg. Patton's Third Army stood on the doorstep of the Siegfried Line, Germany's western wall of defense. To the men in the cabs, the journey had become more dangerous than ever. German air raids intensified. Strafing runs by Focke-Wulf fighters tore down upon the columns, scattering trucks and forcing drivers into ditches. But the Americans refused to yield. Convoy commanders ordered their men to drive through the attacks, never stopping, never swerving from the mission. Those who were hit were pulled off the road, their cargo reloaded onto other trucks. The line never broke. The Ghost Convoy had become more than a rumor. It was a nightmare to the German front. Wehrmacht units, cut off from supply and retreating under fire, reported that the Americans were advancing on rivers of gasoline. No matter how many fuel depots they destroyed, the U.S. tanks never seemed to slow. The Red Ball Express was now feeding two entire field armies, Hodge's 1st and Patton's 3rd, and keeping them alive hundreds of miles beyond the range of any rail support. When fuel finally ran low in late September, Patton himself famously ordered a temporary halt, not because of defeat, but because his supply line had reached the limit of human endurance. In just 82 days, the Red Ball Express had transported over 412,000 tons of ammunition, fuel, and rations. For the German commanders facing them, The revelation was devastating. They had believed the Allies' speed was a short-lived surge, a fluke of momentum after Normandy. But now, as columns of Sherman tanks reached the Moselle and the Meuse, it became clear. This was not chaos, but choreography. The Americans were moving as one vast machine, their logistics functioning with precision that the Wehrmacht, once the master of movement, could no longer match. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt described it later as the moment the tide of war became industrial. The German war machine, strangled by fuel shortages, shattered railways, and Allied air superiority, could not compete with an enemy whose strength lay in its engines, its organization, and the men who kept them running. When Patton's UDTU troops captured Nancy and crossed the Moselle River in mid-September, the myth of the phantom convoy turned into a humiliating truth for the German army. It wasn't magic. It wasn't hidden pipelines or underground roads. It was the American soldier, tired, oil-stained, and unyielding, driving a 212-ton truck through hell to keep history moving forward. In the distance, the German lines began to crumble. The Wehrmacht, still reeling from the pace of pursuit, could barely believe what it had witnessed. An army that fought with fuel as fiercely as with fire. And in that moment, as Patton's armored spearheads rolled across the French border toward the heart of Germany, the ghost convoy had done what no weapon alone could achieve. It crushed the front by sheer motion. The Germans had been right about one thing. It truly was unstoppable. When the Red Ball Express finally slowed in November 1944, the men who had driven through the inferno of France were barely standing. Their faces were lined with fatigue, their uniforms soaked with oil, sweat, and rain. Some trucks had run for over 40,000 miles without rest. Engines patched together with wire and prayer, tires bald, transmissions rattling like bones. Yet the results were undeniable. In less than 3 months, the Red Ball Express had delivered over 412,000 tons of supplies to the front, more than any road operation in history. Its impact could be measured not just in numbers, but in victory itself. The Allied advance across France, the liberation of Paris, and the encirclement of German forces along the Seine all depended on those convoys that never stopped moving. Behind every tank that fired and every gun that roared was a truck that had made the impossible journey through mud, rain, and danger. The Red Ball drivers became an invisible brotherhood of the battlefield. Unarmed, uncelebrated, but indispensable. German prisoners captured in the fall of 1944 often spoke of the same disbelief. They had destroyed bridges, bombed depots, and cut rail lines, yet the Americans always had more. One captured panzer officer described the experience bluntly. We fought an army that seemed to have no limit. For every tank we destroyed, 2 more appeared. We began to think their supply lines were not human. Inside the Allied command, that limitless supply line was no illusion. It was the result of discipline and sacrifice. Over 75% of Red Ball Express personnel were African American soldiers. Many had enlisted hoping for combat, only to be assigned to labor battalions. But history would prove that their endurance under fire was just as critical as any man on the front line. Their contribution was recognized in quiet moments, not headlines. Patton, never one to offer easy praise, wrote after the war that his army would have been immobilized were it not for the Red Ball Express. Eisenhower's staff called it the miracle of mobility. Yet the miracle came at a cost. In those 82 days, hundreds of trucks were lost to air raids, ambushes, and accidents. Some drivers never returned, killed in crashes, burned alive in fuel explosions, or lost to exhaustion on blacked-out roads. Others were injured repairing vehicles under enemy fire. Still, they never stopped. Every wrecked truck was dragged aside, its cargo loaded onto another, the line continuing forward. It was an unspoken creed. Nothing halts the convoy. The Germans, watching from collapsing positions along the Siegfried Line, could only marvel at the machine that had overwhelmed them. A supply system so vast, so constant, it seemed to bend the laws of warfare. But even as victory drew nearer, the ghost convoy was already fading into legend. Its purpose fulfilled, its mission nearly complete. The Red Ball Express had done more than deliver supplies. It had carried the Allied armies from the beaches of Normandy to the gates of Germany, and changed the very definition of military power. By December 1944, the Red Ball Express officially ended. The front had advanced so far east that new supply lines took its place. The White Ball, ABC, and XYZ routes, quieter names for the same relentless logistics machine. The original ghost convoy that had carried the war from Normandy to the Seine was now history, but its spirit lived on in every route that followed. When the trucks stopped rolling, the numbers told the story better than any speech. Over 6.5 million gallons of fuel, 100,000 tons of ammunition, and tens of thousands of tons of rations had crossed France aboard those olive-drab trucks. What began as an emergency improvisation became a case study in battlefield logistics, one that would influence every major U.S. military campaign for the next 80 years. But for the men who had driven those convoys, the legacy was personal. Most Red Ball drivers were never decorated, never filmed, never mentioned in the newspapers. They returned home quietly, some to segregation, some to silence, many still bearing the scars of fatigue and fear. Yet in 1944, in the mud of northern France, they had proven something the world could not ignore: that logistics wins wars as surely as courage does. General Eisenhower himself would later admit that without the Red Ball Express, the advance from Normandy to the Rhine would have been impossible. Patton's tanks, Montgomery's armored columns, Bradley's infantry divisions, all of them were powered by the hands of men few generals ever met. Decades later, historians would call the Red Ball Express one of the greatest feats of wartime engineering ever attempted. It was, in every sense, a bridge built not of steel, but of willpower, a road that carried freedom across a broken continent. Even the Germans, in their after-action reports, struggled to comprehend it. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the senior German commander in the West, wrote bitterly after the war, "We underestimated the American capacity to supply. Their trucks defeated us more surely than their tanks." And so the myth of the ghost convoy became reality. Not through mystery, but through men, through sleepless nights, busted axles, and roads marked by the sound of grinding gears. It was a triumph of organization, determination, and unity under pressure. Today, along the old highways of Normandy and Chartres, small roadside plaques still mark the Red Ball route. Faded red circles on weathered posts. Farmers still find rusted CCKW parts in their fields, relics of the trucks that once carried history forward at 50 miles an hour. Each piece tells the same story: of an army that refused to stop, of drivers who turned fuel and faith into victory, and of a convoy that became the beating heart of the liberation of Europe. The war would continue into 1945, to the Ardennes, across the Rhine, into Germany itself. But the path had already been paved by those who drove without headlights through the fog of France. The U.S. Army's ghost convoy had done more than crush a front. It had shown the world that the power to move, not just to fight, could change the course of history. In the long shadow of World War II, the story of the U.S. Army's ghost convoy stands as proof that wars are not won only by those who fire the guns, but by those who keep them loaded. The Red Ball Express, born out of necessity, became a symbol of American ingenuity and endurance. It revealed something deeper than logistics, the power of discipline, organization, and belief in a shared goal. From generals at headquarters to young truck drivers with barely a compass and a canteen, the mission bound them together in one purpose: to keep the army moving forward. For the Germans, the sight of endless convoys rolling east under blackout conditions shattered morale. They had built their war machine around speed and surprise, and watched in disbelief as the Allies outpaced them, not with tanks, but with trucks. For the Americans, it was a quiet revolution, a logistical victory written in dust and diesel rather than gunfire. And though the men of the Ghost Convoy faded into history, their achievement never did. The lessons of those convoys, mobility, coordination, human endurance, became the backbone of modern warfare. When historians look back at the liberation of Europe, they often speak of D-Day or Patton's tanks. But beneath every triumph rolled the steady, unseen rhythm of the Red Ball Express, the convoy that carried victory itself.